The Supreme Court chamber fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett approached the podium. The spotlight seemed to follow her, illuminating her bold crimson suit against the mahogany backdrop of America's highest court. Just moments earlier, Justice Sotomayor had cut off 3 previous speakers with dismissive remarks and skeptical glares. Crockett, gripping her notes tightly, her eyes filled with determination, didn't flinch as Sotomayor leaned forward with that same intimidating stare that had silenced seasoned attorneys. The tension in the room was palpable. What happened next left everyone speechless, and may change how Supreme Court justices interact with Congress forever. Before we continue this explosive confrontation, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our latest political showdowns and courtroom dramas. Now let's dive into what really happened when these 2 powerful women faced off. The Supreme Court's grand chamber buzzed with anticipation that Wednesday morning. Justice Sotomayor, appointed by President Obama in 2009, sat prominently on the bench. Her reputation for sharp questioning and progressive opinions had made her both admired and feared in legal circles. At 71, with decades of judicial experience, Sotomayor had developed a commanding presence that could make even the most confident attorneys stumble over their words. Today, she seemed particularly impatient. The case before the court involved voting rights legislation that Sotomayor had previously championed. 3 conservative representatives had already presented arguments opposing the measure, and Sotomayor had systematically dismantled each one with cutting questions and dismissive remarks. "That's enough speculation without legal foundation," she had told the last speaker, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. Next. Across the room stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old former civil rights attorney from Texas, now serving her 2nd term in Congress. Known for her eloquent speeches and unwavering advocacy for voting rights, Crockett had risen quickly through political ranks, but this was her first appearance before the Supreme Court, and many wondered if this relative newcomer would crumble under Sotomayor's intense scrutiny. The stakes couldn't be higher. This case would determine whether millions of Americans in underserved communities would have equal access to voting. For Sotomayor, it was about protecting her judicial legacy. For Crockett, it was about defending the rights she'd fought for throughout her career. "Representative Crockett," the Chief Justice announced, "you have 15 minutes." As Crockett approached the podium, whispers rippled through the gallery. "She's going to get steamrolled," one legal analyst murmured to another. "Sotomayor isn't in the mood today." Sotomayor didn't wait for Crockett to begin. "Congresswoman, I've read your brief, and frankly, I'm concerned about the lack of constitutional precedent supporting your position. Perhaps you could start by explaining why the court should ignore 80 years of established case law." The question wasn't just challenging, it was designed to throw Crockett off balance before she'd even spoken her first word. The audience tensed, wondering how the Congresswoman would respond to this immediate confrontation. Crockett paused, taking a deliberate breath as she arranged her notes. Unlike the previous speakers who had rushed to answer Sotomayor's question, she took her time. The silence stretched for 5 long seconds, an eternity in Supreme Court arguments. "Justice Sotomayor," Crockett began, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your directness. Before addressing your question about precedent, I'd like to establish the factual context that makes this case unique." Sotomayor's eyebrows raised slightly. "We have limited time, Congresswoman. Please get to the legal argument." Crockett nodded respectfully but stood her ground. "The legal argument is inseparable from the facts, Your Honor, and the facts show systematic disenfranchisement that previous cases never addressed." She began laying out statistics about polling place closures in minority neighborhoods, presenting evidence methodically and precisely. 2 minutes into her presentation, Sotomayor interrupted again. "These sociological observations, while interesting, don't address the constitutional question before us," Sotomayor said, her tone growing sharper. "I'm asking about legal precedent, not policy preferences." The gallery watched as Crockett calmly reorganized her papers. The confrontation was building, but Crockett wasn't backing down. Justice Sotomayor, with all due respect, in your 2020 dissent in the Arizona voting rights case, you yourself emphasized the importance of real-world impact when interpreting voting legislation. I'm providing exactly that context. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Crockett had just used Sotomayor's own words against her. The justice's expression darkened. That case involved different statutory provisions, Congresswoman. Please, don't mischaracterize my opinions to support your argument. Crockett remained unruffled. I'm not mischaracterizing anything, Your Honor. I'm citing the principle you establish, which applies broadly to voting rights jurisprudence. Sotomayor leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge that made junior clerks in the room wince. Congressman Crockett, this court's time is valuable. If you can't address the constitutional questions directly, perhaps you should yield your time. The tension in the room escalated dramatically. Justice Elena Kagan glanced sideways at Sotomayor, clearly surprised by the harshness of her colleague's tone. The Chief Justice shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene. Crockett stood silently for a moment, looking directly at Sotomayor. The room held its breath, waiting for her response. "Justice Sotomayor," she finally said, her voice lower but even more focused. "I have great respect for this court and for your distinguished career. But I will not yield my time when the voting rights of millions of Americans are at stake." She then turned to her legal brief and began systematically addressing precedent cases, dissecting each one with precision that revealed her background as a civil rights attorney. As she spoke, she methodically built toward her central argument, laying groundwork that would be difficult to dismiss. 5 minutes into this detailed analysis, Sotomayor interrupted again. "Congresswoman, you're reinterpreting Shelby County in a way that fundamentally misunderstands the majority's reasoning." Crockett looked up from her notes. "Am I, Your Honor, or am I pointing out the flaws in that reasoning that have led to the very voter suppression statistics I began with?" The directness of the question created another ripple of whispers through the courtroom. Supreme Court advocates rarely challenge justices this directly, especially one as senior as Sotomayor. Justice Samuel Alito, sensing the unusual tension, attempted to redirect the discussion. "Perhaps we could focus on Section 2 implications rather than relitigating Shelby County?" But Sotomayor wasn't ready to let go. "Before we move on, I want to be clear about something, Congresswoman Crockett. This court makes decisions based on constitutional interpretation, not popular opinion or political pressure. Your implication that our reasoning in Shelby County was flawed crosses the line of appropriate advocacy." The rebuke was harsh, and many in the gallery expected Crockett to retreat or apologize. Instead, she stood straighter, her expression calm but resolute. "Justice Sotomayor, I've appeared before hundreds of judges in my career as an attorney. I have always been taught that respectful but vigorous advocacy is not just appropriate, it's essential to our legal system. When the court decided Plessy v. Ferguson, was it inappropriate for lawyers in Brown v. Board to argue that the reasoning was flawed? The comparison to one of the most notoriously wrong decisions in court history caused audible gasps. Sotomayor's face flushed. The Chief Justice looked like he might intervene, but Crockett continued before he could. "I'm not comparing Shelby County to Plessy in substance, but in principle, courts reconsider precedents when their real-world effects undermine constitutional rights. The data I'm presenting shows exactly that kind of effect." Justice Sotomayor's voice cut through the chamber like ice. "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm going to ask you one final time to address the specific constitutional question before this court without these provocative analogies and political speeches. If you cannot do that, I suggest you sit down and let someone else use this valuable time." Every eye in the room turned to Crockett. The moment of truth had arrived. How would she respond to this direct attempt to silence her? Jasmine Crockett stood perfectly still at the podium, the weight of Sotomayor's ultimatum hanging in the air. The courtroom remained so silent, you could hear the vintage clock ticking on the wall. For 3 long seconds, Crockett maintained eye contact with Justice Sotomayor, neither woman willing to look away first. Then, with deliberate movements, Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document that hadn't been in her hands before. The paper had an official Supreme Court header visible even from the gallery. "Justice Sotomayor," Crockett began, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "Before I respond to your suggestion that I sit down, I'd like to quote something I believe is relevant to this moment." She held up the document. "These aren't my words, they're yours. From your memoir, My Beloved World. You wrote, 'A courtroom is not a place where you should have to leave your dignity at the door.'" Crockett paused, letting the words sink in. Sotomayor's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a flash of recognition crossing her face. "You also wrote," Crockett continued, "I have never, ever focused on the negative. I always look at the positive in any situation. While some might call me an idealist, I believe that having hope is what allows us to move forward, even in difficult times." Murmurs spread through the courtroom as Crockett continued, "Justice Sotomayor, I stand before this court not just as a congresswoman, but as someone who grew up in a community where voting rights weren't theoretical constitutional questions, they were daily struggles. When I was a civil rights attorney in Texas, I represented clients who waited 6 hours to vote because polling stations in their neighborhoods were systematically closed." She turned a page in her notes. "And this is why your own words from the bench in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee resonate so deeply with me. You said then, courts should not be in the business of unduly second-guessing the reasonable judgments of elected officials. Yet today, you seem to be second-guessing not just my judgments, but my very right to present them to this court." The gallery was completely still now, captivated by the unexpected turn. "And perhaps most relevant to this moment," Crockett said, her voice gaining strength but never losing its respectful tone, "you wrote in your 2018 dissent in Abbott v. Perez, 'The right to vote is preservative of all rights.' That's because, in our democracy, all other rights flow from the ability to participate in selecting who governs us." Crockett looked directly at Sotomayor. "That's not a provocative analogy or a political speech. Those are your words, Your Honor. Words that inspired me and countless others who believe in equal justice under law." She carefully placed the document down and squared her shoulders. "So no, Justice Sotomayor, I will not sit down. Not when the rights you yourself have so eloquently defended are at stake. I will not yield my time, I will not be silenced, because doing so would betray everything you taught attorneys like me about dignity, advocacy, and justice." The courtroom erupted in hushed conversations. Several journalists frantically scribbled notes. Justice Kagan leaned over to whisper something to Justice Gorsuch, who nodded with what appeared to be reluctant admiration. Sotomayor sat completely still, her face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed the entire Supreme Court held its breath, waiting for her response. Then slowly, Sotomayor reached for her microphone. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her tone noticeably different, "you have made your point about advocacy with dots of considerable skill." She paused. "Please proceed with your constitutional argument." It wasn't an apology, but in Supreme Court terms, it was an extraordinary concession. Crockett had stood her ground and earned Sotomayor's respect, in full view of the nation's legal elite. Crockett nodded once, acknowledging the moment without gloating. Then, with newfound attention from every justice on the bench, she launched into the most powerful legal argument of her career. The constitutional question before this court isn't really about precedent, it's about purpose. The 15th Amendment wasn't just words on parchment, it was a promise to every American that their voice matters. For the next 10 minutes, Crockett delivered a masterclass in constitutional interpretation, weaving together historical context, legal precedent, and contemporary evidence with such clarity that even justices known to oppose her position were leaning forward, engaged. When Justice Thomas asked a challenging question about state sovereignty, Crockett responded with such precision that he nodded, a rare sign of approval from the court's most silent member. As her allotted time neared its end, Crockett circled back to address Sotomayor directly once more. "Justice Sotomayor, you asked why the court should reconsider precedent. I submit that when precedent becomes a tool to deny the very rights the Constitution promises to protect, Reconsideration isn't just permitted, it's required. As you yourself wrote in your Shelby County dissent, history did not end in 1965, neither did it end with the court's last decision on voting rights, Crockett gathered her notes. The real question isn't why this court should act to protect voting rights. The question is how this court can possibly justify not acting when the evidence of systematic disenfranchisement is so clear. The Chief Justice informed her that her time had expired. Crockett thanked the court and returned to her seat, the room still electrified by what they had witnessed. As she sat down, something unprecedented happened. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward and spoke without being prompted by the Chief Justice. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "while I may not ultimately agree with all your conclusions, your advocacy today honors the highest traditions of this court. Your constituents and clients are fortunate to have such formidable representation." Coming from Sotomayor, known for her tough questioning, this was the judicial equivalent of a standing ovation. Law clerks exchanged glances of disbelief. Several senior attorneys in the gallery shook their heads in amazement. Jasmine Crockett had not only refused to be silenced, she had changed the very tone of the proceedings, and possibly the outcome of the case. And she had done it by using Sotomayor's own words and principles to hold the justice accountable to her best self. The impact of the Crockett-Sotomayor exchange reverberated far beyond the Supreme Court chambers. As the session adjourned, the marble hallways filled with animated conversations, legal experts analyzing every word and gesture of the unprecedented confrontation. CNN legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, caught on camera in the court's press area, was overheard saying, "In 20 years covering the court, I've never seen anything like it." Crockett didn't just hold her ground, she changed the entire dynamic of oral arguments. Within 30 minutes, clips of the exchange began circulating on social media. The hashtag #CrockettWantsSitDown started trending nationwide, with users from across the political spectrum weighing in on the confrontation. Outside the court, a crowd of reporters surrounded Crockett as she emerged. She maintained her composure, offering only a brief statement. "Today wasn't about me or Justice Sotomayor. It was about ensuring that every American's vote counts equally. That's the only victory that matters." Meanwhile, inside the justices' conference room, sources later revealed an extraordinary scene unfolding. Justice Kagan reportedly approached Sotomayor, placing a hand on her colleague's arm. "Sonia, are you all right?" she asked. Sotomayor, still processing the exchange, looked up with an expression colleagues rarely saw. Genuine surprise mixed with grudging admiration. "She used my own words," Sotomayor reportedly said. "Not out of context, not twisted, but to remind me of principles I've fought for my entire career." The significance of the confrontation extended far beyond a single case. By evening, legal blogs were publishing analyses with titles like "The Crockett Doctrine, Respectful Defiance as Effective Advocacy," and how Jasmine Crockett rewrote the rules of Supreme Court argument. Fox News aired a segment titled "Crockett Stands Her Ground, Congresswoman Refuses to Be Silenced by Liberal Justice." Meanwhile, MSNBC ran with "Crockett Uses Sotomayor's Own Words to Defend Voting Rights in Historic Exchange." The White House press secretary was asked about the confrontation during the afternoon briefing. "The president believes strongly in both an independent judiciary and the right of advocates to make their case vigorously. Beyond that, we'll let the court's deliberations proceed without comment." As evening fell, the confrontation took on even greater significance when three moderate justices, who had previously seemed skeptical of Crockett's position, requested additional briefing on the statistical evidence she had presented, a rare move that signaled her arguments had broken through. Legal experts began speculating that the case, which had seemed destined for a predictable 6-3 split along ideological lines, might now produce a more nuanced ruling with partial concurrences from unexpected quarters. By the next morning, law professors were already revising their syllabi to include the Crockett-Sotomayor exchange in courses on appellate advocacy. Georgetown Law announced a special symposium titled "Speaking Truth to Judicial Power: Lessons from Crockett v. Sotomayor." For Jasmine Crockett personally, The aftermath brought both opportunity and challenge. Interview requests flooded her office. Constitutional law professors from Harvard to Stanford invited her to speak. 3 book publishers reached out with contract offers. Yet Crockett remained focused on the case itself. When a senior Democratic leader called to congratulate her on putting Sotomayor in her place, Crockett reportedly cut the conversation short. "That's not what happened yesterday," she said firmly. "I didn't win against Justice Sotomayor. If anything, I reminded her of who she is at her best. The only victory that matters is protecting voting rights." 2 weeks later, the court issued its ruling. While complex and nuanced, the 7-2 decision upheld critical protections for voting access that many legal experts had predicted would be struck down. In a surprising move, Justice Sotomayor wrote a concurring opinion that cited directly to statistical evidence Crockett had presented. The final paragraph of Sotomayor's concurrence seemed to acknowledge the confrontation without directly mentioning it. This court benefits most from advocates who remind us not just of what the law is, but what it means to those whose rights depend upon our faithful interpretation of it. When such advocacy is presented with both passion and precision, it honors the highest traditions of the bar and the bench alike. For young attorneys and law students watching the case unfold, the lesson was clear. Speaking truth to power, even judicial power, sometimes requires refusing to be silenced. Crockett's approach, grounded in deep respect for the institution while firmly defending her right to be heard, offered a masterclass in effective advocacy. The confrontation became a defining moment in both women's careers. For Crockett, establishing her as a national voice for voting rights with unimpeachable credentials. For Sotomayor, demonstrating that even the most respected jurists can benefit from being held accountable to their own highest principles. Perhaps most importantly, it shifted the national conversation about voting rights from abstract legal theories to concrete impacts on real communities. Crockett's refusal to be silenced ensured that the voices of those who had stood in 6-hour lines to vote would be heard in the highest court in the land. 6 months later, as Congress debated new voting rights legislation, representatives from both parties referenced the Crockett standard of evidence-based advocacy. The confrontation that began with an attempt to silence had amplified voices far beyond the Supreme Court chambers. As one civil rights veteran observed, sometimes refusing to sit down is the most powerful thing you can do. Jasmine Crockett showed us that standing your ground can change not just a case, but the course of justice itself. And that may be the most enduring legacy of the day Justice Sotomayor tried to silence Congresswoman Crockett only to find herself reminded of her own powerful words and principles. Proof that sometimes the most effective argument is holding a mirror to someone's better self. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Sonia Sotomayor reminds us that in America's ongoing struggle for justice, courage and conviction still matter. Well, standing firm for what's right, even when the most powerful voices try to silence you, can change not just a moment, but a movement. If you found this breakdown of the historic Crockett-Sotomayor confrontation valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of the most important political and legal showdowns shaping our nation. Hit that notification bell so you'll never miss our latest uploads. And leave a comment below telling us what other courtroom confrontations you'd like us to cover next. Remember, the truth prevails when brave voices refuse to be silenced.